Sometimes the fiercest hearts only know how to ask for kindness by pretending to bite. The first crack of thunder rolled across Black Hollow Forest just as Clara Bennett tightened the hood of her faded cloak and hurried deeper beneath the towering pines, her worn leather satchel bumping gently against her side with every careful step. The townspeople always warned that no sensible soul wandered these woods once the skies turned dark, but the rare moonroot herb she needed only bloomed after heavy rain, and without selling them at the Saturday market, there would be no money to buy flour, lamp oil, or the medicine her elderly aunt quietly depended on. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin, bending the branches until they groaned like old ships riding rough water. Yet Clara continued forward, more familiar with these winding trails than the crowded streets of Ashbourne Village. She had spent years learning that the forest judged no one by status, by birth, or by whispered rumors. Trees did not care that she was an Omega. Streams did not mock her quiet voice. Birds never laughed because she preferred healing plants over grand celebrations. Nature simply accepted whoever entered with respect. She knelt beside a cluster of silver-green leaves glistening beneath the rain and smiled softly as she gathered them into her satchel, unaware that somewhere beyond the curtain of mist, a pair of brilliant silver eyes had already begun watching her every move. A low growl drifted through the woods, so deep that it seemed to vibrate beneath her boots instead of through the air. Clara slowly stood, listening. Another growl answered from somewhere farther ahead, rougher this time, carrying equal parts warning and exhaustion. Most people would have turned back immediately, but something inside her whispered that this was not the voice of a hunter searching for prey. It sounded lonely. She stepped carefully through dripping ferns until the trees opened into a small clearing where rainwater shimmered across dark stones. There, beside the roots of a fallen oak, stood the largest wolf she had ever seen. Its midnight coat was soaked by the storm, every muscle held tight with restless tension, its ears flattened as another growl escaped its throat. The animal looked magnificent despite the obvious fatigue weighing down its posture. One front leg barely touched the ground, and its breathing came unevenly, as though every breath demanded effort. The moment their eyes met, the wolf bared its teeth and released a sharp warning that echoed across the clearing. Clara instinctively stopped moving. She neither ran nor reached toward it. Instead, she lowered her gaze just enough to show she meant no challenge. Rain collected along the edge of her hood, and slipped silently onto the forest floor between them. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the falling rain. "I'm not here to take anything from you." The wolf answered with another impatient growl and shifted its weight, only to stumble slightly before catching itself. Clara noticed the fresh scrape along its shoulder where dark fur had been torn away by rough branches or jagged stone. It was not a terrible wound, but it explained the uneven steps and guarded posture. "You really are in a bad mood," she murmured with the faintest smile. "I'd probably be grumpy too." For the first time, the wolf did not growl immediately. Instead, it stared at her with unsettling intelligence, its silver eyes searching her face as though trying to solve a question no one had ever asked before. The wind suddenly changed direction, carrying Clara's scent through the clearing. The wolf stiffened, its ears lifting ever so slightly. Then, without warning, it took one slow step toward her before freezing again, uncertainty replacing anger for the briefest moment. Clara remained perfectly still, her heartbeat steady despite the impossible closeness between them, and neither of them noticed the distant silhouette of a cloaked rider watching silently from the ridge beyond the trees before disappearing into the rain. The wolf remained motionless, its silver eyes never leaving Clara as another gentle wave of rain swept through the clearing. She could feel the distance between them shrinking, not because either of them moved very much, but because fear slowly gave way to curiosity. Clara carefully reached into her satchel without breaking eye contact. The animal instantly lowered its head, another warning rumbling from deep within its chest, yet it did not retreat. She slowly removed a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs and held it where the wolf could see it. "You probably think every person wants something from you," she said softly. "I only want to help if you will let me." The wolf tilted its head ever so slightly, almost as if it were trying to understand every word. A cold gust swept through the trees, carrying loose leaves around the clearing. Clara noticed the injured leg trembling beneath the animal's weight. Whatever had happened before, she found it had left more than a scrape across its shoulder. It looked exhausted. She carefully knelt several feet away and placed the cloth pouch on a flat stone between them before backing away another step. "You can decide," she whispered. "I will not force you." For several long seconds neither one moved. Rain tapped softly against the fallen oak while distant thunder rolled farther into the mountains. Finally, the great wolf limped forward one cautious step at a time until it reached the stone. It lowered its nose toward the herbs, sniffed them carefully, then lifted its gaze back to Clara with an expression that no ordinary animal should have possessed. There was suspicion, certainly, but there was also thoughtfulness, almost gratitude hidden beneath years of distrust. Clara slowly opened a small tin from her satchel, revealing a healing salve she had prepared herself from pine resin, lavender, and mountain herbs. The familiar scent drifted into the cool air. "This might sting for a second," she admitted with a tiny smile. "Although judging by your personality, you might pretend it hurts more just to scare me." To her surprise, the corners of the wolf's mouth relaxed just enough that the fierce expression softened. It was not a smile, not really, but the change was enough to encourage her. Inch by inch, she stepped closer until she could finally kneel beside the enormous creature. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she gently reached toward its injured shoulder. The wolf flinched, muscles tightening beneath its soaked fur. But instead of snapping or pulling away, it simply watched her. Clara spread the salve with slow, careful movements, speaking quietly the entire time as though comforting an anxious friend rather than one of the most intimidating animals she had ever encountered. She told it about the tiny cottage at the edge of the woods, about the herbs growing behind the fence, about the bluebirds that returned every spring to nest beneath her porch roof. The wolf listened in complete silence. Somehow the storm no longer seemed quite as cold. When she finished wrapping the shoulder with a clean strip of linen, the wolf lowered itself onto the damp ground with a weary sigh that sounded almost human. Clara laughed softly. "That is better, is not it?" she asked. "You have spent so much energy pretending to be frightening that you forgot how tired you were." The wolf rested its head on its front paws but refused to close its eyes completely, watching her through half-open silver eyes as twilight slowly settled across the forest. Clara remained beside it until the rain became little more than a whisper through the branches. Neither of them noticed that high above the clearing, hidden among the cliffs overlooking Black Hollow, the same cloaked rider had returned once again, silently observing the impossible trust growing between the lonely Omega and the mysterious wolf before disappearing without leaving a single trace. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Clara Bennett's tiny cottage, painting warm patterns across the wooden floor as birds greeted the new day with cheerful songs. She stretched quietly, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of the forest beyond her window, but something unusual made her pause. The porch was silent. The clearing outside looked perfectly ordinary, yet she immediately sensed that something had changed. Pulling on her boots, she stepped outside and glanced toward the old pine where she had left the enormous wolf resting only hours before. The place was empty. The rain had washed away nearly every footprint, leaving only flattened grass and a few strands of dark fur caught against a broken branch. Clara slowly walked toward the spot, her heart unexpectedly heavy. She had known the wolf would leave eventually. Wild creatures belonged beneath open skies, not beside people. Even so, the quiet absence felt strangely personal. She crouched beside the fallen oak and noticed something glimmering beneath a layer of wet leaves. Brushing them aside, she uncovered a beautifully crafted silver medallion shaped like a crescent moon surrounded by tiny oak leaves. It was unlike anything sold in Ashbourne Village. The workmanship was flawless, the metal surprisingly warm despite the cool morning air. There were no initials, no family crest she recognized, only an elegant symbol carved into the center that seemed strangely familiar. Clara slipped the medallion into her pocket, assuming it must have fallen from some traveler long ago. "I suppose you left me a mystery instead of a goodbye," she whispered with a gentle smile before returning home. The rest of the day unfolded peacefully. She bundled fresh herbs for the market, repaired a loose fence behind the cottage, and prepared another batch of healing salve while humming softly to herself. Yet every so often her thoughts drifted back to those remarkable silver eyes that had watched her so carefully through the storm. She wondered whether the wolf had found a safer place to recover, whether its shoulder still ached, whether it had eaten anything since leaving. The question surprised even her. She had cared for injured animals before, but none had lingered so vividly in her thoughts. As afternoon faded into evening, golden light spilled across the meadow outside her cottage. Clara carried a basket of freshly baked bread onto the porch to cool, smiling as the familiar scent filled the air. Suddenly, a distant sound interrupted the peaceful silence. Hoofbeats. Not one horse but many. They echoed steadily along the narrow forest road, calm and deliberate rather than hurried. Clara looked toward the trees as several magnificent black horses emerged between the pines, each ridden by men wearing dark cloaks fastened with polished silver clasps. Their movements were disciplined, almost ceremonial. At their center rode a tall man whose presence immediately drew every glance without demanding it. His posture was straight, his expression composed, and although his face remained partly hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, there was an unmistakable quiet authority surrounding him. The rider stopped before her gate with perfect precision. None of them spoke at first. The forest itself seemed to fall silent, as though even the birds had paused to watch. Clara tightened her grip on the porch railing, uncertain whether to feel concerned or simply confused. She had never seen royal riders this far from the capital. One of the men dismounted and approached the gate with respectful calm. Before he could speak, the tall figure at the center slowly lifted his gaze toward Clara. Even from across the yard, she felt an odd sense of recognition she could not explain. There was something hauntingly familiar about those eyes beneath the hood, something that stirred the memory of rain, silver light, and a lonely creature standing beneath ancient pines. The stranger remained silent for one long heartbeat before stepping down from his horse with effortless grace and walking toward her cottage as though he already knew exactly where he was meant to be. Clara stood quietly on the porch, the warm scent of fresh bread mixing with the cool breeze drifting through the pines as the tall stranger stopped a few feet from the wooden steps. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The late afternoon sunlight caught the silver clasp fastening his dark cloak, and the polished metal reflected a narrow beam of light across the porch floor. The men behind him remained perfectly still beside their horses, disciplined enough to seem almost carved from stone. Clara had never witnessed such silence among travelers. It was not uncomfortable, only deliberate, as though every movement carried meaning. The stranger slowly lowered his hood, revealing dark hair brushed back from a calm, striking face marked more by quiet confidence than pride. His silver eyes settled on Clara with remarkable focus, and once again she felt the strange familiarity she could not explain. It was as though she had already seen those eyes.
Somewhere impossible.
Miss Clara Bennet? He asked, his voice deep but measured. Yes, she answered carefully. May I ask who is looking for me? Before the stranger could answer, the rider who had first approached stepped forward and bowed respectfully. His Majesty, Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft. Clara blinked in surprise, instinctively lowering her eyes before remembering to offer a proper greeting. Every child in the Northern Territories had heard stories about the Alpha King, yet none had prepared her for the calm presence standing before her. There was no need for raised voices or displays of authority. Respect simply seemed to gather naturally around him. Your Majesty, she said softly, I was not expecting visitors. A faint smile touched Lucian's expression. Few people do. His gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the open cottage door. May I come inside? Clara hesitated only long enough to move aside. Of course. The small cottage suddenly felt even smaller as the king stepped across the threshold. His eyes traveled quietly across the room, lingering on shelves lined with neatly labeled jars of herbs, drying flowers hanging from ceiling beams, stacks of well-read books, and a simple stone fireplace where a kettle still warmed over gentle coals. Nothing in the cottage suggested wealth, yet everything reflected care. Lucian paused beside the wooden table where several folded strips of clean linen rested beside an open jar of healing salve. His fingers hovered just above the familiar herbs before he glanced toward Clara. You prepared these yourself? She nodded. Mostly from plants growing around the forest. You spend a great deal of time helping injured animals. Clara smiled. Sometimes people too. Lucian looked at the fresh bandages for another quiet moment before asking a question that seemed oddly specific. Do you always treat creatures that greet you with growling? Clara laughed softly before she could stop herself. Not always. Only the stubborn ones. For the first time, genuine amusement flickered across Lucian's face. It disappeared almost immediately, but Clara noticed it. And if they try to frighten you, he continued. She shrugged gently. Fear usually hides something else. Hunger, loneliness, pain. If I only listened to the growling, I would never understand what caused it. Lucian remained silent after her answer. The room seemed strangely still, the crackling fire becoming the only sound between them. His eyes settled on the folded linen once more, then drifted toward Clara's hands as though confirming something only he understood. Outside, one of the horses stamped lightly against the ground, but none of the royal guards interrupted the silence. Finally, Lucian spoke again, his voice quieter than before. 3 nights ago, during the storm in Black Hollow Forest, did you happen to meet an unusual wolf? Clara's heartbeat quickened. She searched his expression for some hint of accusation but found only calm curiosity. Yes, she admitted honestly. I did. Lucian held her gaze without blinking. Then I believe you may possess the answer to a question my kingdom has been asking for several days. Clara looked at Lucian for a long moment, trying to understand why the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories would travel to a quiet cottage because of a single wounded wolf. She folded her hands calmly and nodded. I found him during the storm. He was injured, exhausted, and determined to convince me he disliked everyone. A faint warmth returned to Lucian's expression. That sounds familiar. Clara continued. He never attacked me. He only wanted me to stay away. After I cleaned his shoulder and wrapped the injury, he rested until morning. When I woke up, he was gone. Lucian slowly walked toward the window overlooking the forest, his eyes lingering on the distant tree line where the storm had passed only days before. Did he leave anything behind? Clara hesitated before reaching into the pocket of her apron. She carefully placed the silver medallion on the wooden table. I found this where he had been lying. I assumed it belonged to another traveler. The moment Lucian saw the medallion, his usually composed expression softened with unmistakable relief. He picked it up with great care, turning it between his fingers before smiling quietly. It has belonged to my family. For generations. Clara looked at him in surprise. Then the wolf. Lucian met her eyes. Belonged to me. She blinked, trying to understand. It was your companion? For a brief moment, none of the royal guards outside moved. Even the gentle breeze drifting through the open window seemed to pause. Lucian answered with complete honesty. Not exactly. He rested the medallion on the table again. Among our people, there are ancient gifts that few outsiders ever witness. During moments of great danger or overwhelming exhaustion, some of us become what we truly are beneath titles, crowns, and ceremonies. Clara searched his face, remembering the remarkable intelligence behind those silver eyes in the forest. The memory suddenly settled into place like the final piece of an unfinished puzzle. Those eyes, she whispered almost to herself. Lucian nodded once. Yes. She stared at him, astonishment filling her expression without a trace of fear. You were the wolf. Instead of denying it, Lucian simply smiled, quiet and genuine. I was. Clara looked toward the forest through the open doorway, then back at the man standing in her tiny cottage. That explains why you seemed familiar the moment I saw you. Lucian gave a thoughtful nod. Very few people have ever seen me in that form and lived their entire lives believing it was only an ordinary encounter. You, however, chose something different. You saw a frightened creature instead of a monster. You offered kindness instead of suspicion. Clara lowered her eyes with quiet humility. You were hurt. That was all I needed to know. Lucian studied her answer carefully, almost as though it confirmed something far more important than he had expected. My council believed whoever encountered me would run away or attempt to gain favor by spreading stories across the kingdom. Instead, you returned home, continued your work, and told no one. Clara smiled gently. Some moments belong to the people who experience them. Not every story needs to become gossip. The Alpha King let out a soft breath that almost sounded like relief. Then perhaps I came to the right door after all. Outside, the golden light of evening settled across the meadow while the royal guards quietly waited beside their horses. Inside the little cottage, the distance between a humble Omega healer and the ruler of an entire kingdom seemed to shrink with every honest word they exchanged. neither of them noticing that beyond the edge of the forest, another unseen pair of watchful eyes had quietly fixed upon the cottage, following every arrival and every moment of unexpected trust. The peaceful silence inside the cottage lasted only a few more moments before Lucian's expression grew thoughtful again. He picked up the silver medallion one final time, then carefully returned it to Clara instead of slipping it into his own pocket. "Keep it," he said quietly. Clara looked at him in surprise. "It belongs to your family." Lucian nodded. "It also marks the place where someone chose compassion without expecting anything in return. I believe it found the right owner." Clara hesitated before accepting it with both hands. The cool silver rested against her palm, carrying an unexpected weight that felt far greater than the metal itself. Outside, the horses shifted uneasily, their ears turning toward the forest as though they sensed something hidden beyond the trees. One of the royal guards stepped onto the porch and lowered his voice respectfully. "Your Majesty." Lucian turned toward him immediately. "Report." Fresh tracks were discovered along the eastern ridge shortly before we arrived. Someone has been following the royal patrol from a distance. Clara noticed the subtle change in every guard. None of them appeared frightened, but each became noticeably more alert. Lucian remained calm. "Did anyone approach the property?" "No, Your Majesty. Whoever it was stayed hidden." Lucian gave a slight nod, dismissing the guard with a quiet gesture before closing the cottage door. Clara watched him carefully. "Is someone searching for you?" For a brief moment he looked toward the forest through the window. There are always people interested in the movements of a king. His answer was truthful, but Clara sensed it was not the entire story. "Does it have something to do with what happened during the storm?" Lucian considered the question before replying. The storm was not the problem. It simply gave someone an opportunity they believed they could use. Clara folded her arms thoughtfully. "And now they know you survived." "Yes." He spoke the single word with complete composure, yet it carried quiet certainty. Clara glanced toward the medallion resting in her hand. "Then they may also discover that I found you." Lucian met her eyes, and for the first time since arriving, genuine concern appeared in his expression. "That possibility is exactly why I came here myself." Clara was silent. She had expected gratitude, perhaps curiosity, but not protection. Lucian continued carefully. "The fewer people who know about our meeting in the forest, the safer it remains for everyone involved. Unfortunately, whoever has been watching my movements may begin asking questions of their own." Clara walked toward the open shelf beside the fireplace and gently placed the medallion beside a small carved wooden bird her late father had made years earlier. "I have lived quietly my entire life," she said. "I do not know anything about royal politics." "That is precisely why I trust your judgment," Lucian answered. "You looked at a wounded stranger and saw someone worth helping instead of someone worth using." Before Clara could respond, a soft sound drifted through the open kitchen window. It was faint, almost impossible to notice unless someone knew the forest well. She immediately recognized it as the nervous call of a pair of blue jays. They always made that sound whenever unfamiliar people entered the woods behind her cottage. Clara slowly turned toward the window. "Someone else is out there," she whispered. Lucian listened for only a heartbeat before giving a nearly invisible signal toward the guards outside. None of them rushed forward or reached for weapons. Instead, they quietly spread through the meadow with practiced discipline, careful not to disturb the peaceful evening. Clara stepped onto the porch beside Lucian, both of them watching the tree line where golden sunlight faded into deep green shadows. The forest looked perfectly ordinary, yet every instinct she had developed after years of living beside Black Hollow told her they were no longer alone, and somewhere beyond the last row of ancient pines, unseen eyes continued watching the little cottage with patient determination. The last rays of sunlight slipped behind the towering pines, leaving the meadow wrapped in soft shades of gold and blue as Clara stood beside Lucian on the porch without saying a word. The forest had always spoken to her in quiet ways. A restless breeze, a startled bird, or an unexpected silence often revealed more than hurried voices ever could. Tonight, every instinct she trusted whispered that someone had been watching far longer than either of them realized. Several minutes passed before one of the royal guards returned from the tree line. He offered a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, we found no one." Whoever was there knew the forest well enough to leave without disturbing the ground. Lucian nodded thoughtfully. Then they achieved exactly what they wanted. Clara looked toward him. To make us wonder if they are still nearby? Precisely. His calm answer carried no fear, only quiet understanding. Sometimes uncertainty creates more confusion than being seen. Clara folded her arms against the cool evening breeze. That sounds exhausting. A faint smile crossed Lucian's face. It becomes ordinary when you wear a crown. She studied him for a moment before saying, "It should not have to." Her simple reply lingered in the air between them. No one had spoken to him with such unaffected honesty in a very long time. Most people measured every word around a king. Clara simply spoke what she believed. As the guards quietly resumed their positions, Lucian stepped off the porch and slowly walked toward the small herb garden beside the cottage. Rows of lavender, rosemary, sage, and moonroot swayed gently in the evening breeze. Clara followed beside him. "You built all of this yourself?" he asked. "Most of it," she answered. "My father planted the first beds before he passed away. I only kept them growing." Lucian knelt beside a row of blooming lavender, gently brushing one flower with his fingertips. The wolf lingered near these plants longer than anywhere else. Clara laughed. Softly. Perhaps he preferred pleasant company over unpleasant medicine. Lucian looked up at her with quiet amusement. Or perhaps he simply trusted the person who cared for them. Before Clara could answer, something unexpected happened. A gentle breeze swept across the garden, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and fresh lavender together. The silver medallion resting inside her apron pocket suddenly grew warm against her hand. She instinctively touched it, surprised by the faint glow spreading across its polished surface. Lucian noticed immediately. His expression changed from curiosity to quiet astonishment. "Has it ever done that before?" Clara slowly shook her head. "Never." The glow lasted only a few seconds before fading as naturally as it had appeared. Neither of them spoke. Even the guard standing several yards away seemed unaware that anything unusual had occurred. Lucian finally broke the silence. "That medallion has remained unchanged for generations." Clara looked down at it once more. "Then why now?" Lucian answered honestly. "I do not know." He hesitated before adding, "Our oldest historians believe certain family heirlooms responded only to moments of extraordinary truth. Most dismissed those stories as legends." Clara gently closed her fingers around the medallion. Maybe some legends simply wait for the right people before reminding the world they were always real. Lucian held her gaze, recognizing the quiet wisdom behind her words. At that same moment, high above the cottage, the first full moon began rising over Black Hollow Forest, bathing the meadow in pale silver light. Neither Clara nor Lucian noticed the lone figure standing deep among the distant trees. Hidden behind ancient branches, the silent observer watched the glowing cottage window for one final moment before turning away, carrying news that would soon travel far beyond the peaceful forest and quietly change both of their lives forever. The moon climbed higher above Black Hollow Forest, covering the quiet meadow in silver light that seemed almost gentle after the long day. Lucian remained beside the herb garden, his eyes lifting briefly toward the glowing sky before returning to Clara. Neither of them hurried to speak. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt comfortable, like two people who had unexpectedly discovered they understood one another better than either had imagined. A royal guard approached from the edge of the property and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, the road back to the capital is ready whenever you wish to depart." Lucian acknowledged him with a slight nod but did not move. Instead he turned toward Clara. "There is something I would like to ask of you." She waited quietly. "Will you visit the royal sanctuary tomorrow?" Clara blinked in surprise. "The sanctuary? It is where our kingdom cares for injured wolves and other creatures that cannot yet return to the wild. I believe they would benefit from someone who understands healing the way you do." Clara looked genuinely confused. "Surely you already have experienced healers." "We do," Lucian replied. "But experience and compassion are not always the same gift." His words settled gently between them. Clara glanced toward the rows of herbs growing beside her cottage. "I have never left this valley for more than a single day." "Then perhaps," Lucian said with a quiet smile, It is time the valley shared you with the rest of the kingdom. She laughed softly, lowering her eyes for a moment. That sounds much larger than I ever imagined my life becoming. Lucian answered without hesitation. The greatest changes often begin with the smallest decisions. 3 days ago you chose to stop walking through the forest. Everything since then has followed that single act of kindness. Clara could not argue with that. She thought back to the lonely wolf standing beneath the rain, to the cautious silver eyes that had slowly traded suspicion for trust, and to the unexpected visitor now standing only a few feet away. None of it had been planned, yet somehow every moment felt connected. She reached into her apron pocket and gently touched the silver medallion again. It remained cool now, resting quietly against her hand as though waiting. If I come, she asked, am I visiting because I helped a wounded wolf or because I met a king? Lucian's expression softened. With unmistakable sincerity. Neither. Clara looked up. Then why? His answer came without the slightest hesitation. Because I believe this kingdom needs more people who choose kindness before judgment. For a moment Clara forgot he wore a crown at all. He simply sounded like a man carrying responsibilities far heavier than anyone should bear alone. She smiled warmly. Then I will come. Relief flickered across Lucian's face before he offered a grateful nod. Thank you. The royal guards quietly prepared the horses while the night breeze carried the fragrance of lavender across the meadow once more. As Lucian stepped toward his horse, he paused beside the cottage gate and looked back one final time. Clara stood beneath the porch lantern, her light brown hair catching the moonlight as she raised one hand in a simple farewell. He returned the gesture with a small smile before mounting his horse. The royal procession slowly disappeared between the ancient pines until only the fading sound of hoofbeats remained. Clara stayed on the porch long after the forest became quiet again. Deep within the trees, an owl called into the night, and somewhere beyond the dark ridges, unseen messengers were already carrying whispers toward the capital. By sunrise, those whispers would reach ears eager to twist truth into rumor, and the peaceful meeting between a humble Omega healer and the Alpha King would become the beginning of a challenge neither of them had yet imagined. The following morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight instead of storm clouds. Yet Clara Bennett sensed that her life had already crossed a quiet threshold from which there would be no returning. She carefully gathered a basket filled with fresh herbs, healing salves, and neatly folded linen before locking the little cottage that had always been her entire world. The silver medallion rested safely beneath her cloak, close to her heart, where it felt less like a royal keepsake and more like a promise she had not yet learned to understand. As she reached the edge of the forest road, a familiar royal carriage waited beneath the towering pines exactly as Lucian had promised. The journey to the royal sanctuary revealed a kingdom Clara had only imagined through stories. Rolling green hills stretched beneath endless blue skies, peaceful villages welcomed travelers with cheerful waves, and every mile reminded her that kindness could quietly connect lives separated by rank, distance, and circumstance. When the carriage finally reached the sanctuary, Clara stepped into a place unlike anything she had ever seen. Injured wolves rested peacefully beside rescued hawks, abandoned fawns wandered safely through flower-filled gardens, and experienced caretakers worked with patient smiles rather than hurried commands. Lucian greeted her without ceremony, dressed simply enough that he looked less like a king and more like the thoughtful man she had first met in her cottage. Throughout the day, Clara forgot entirely that she stood inside royal grounds. She knelt beside frightened animals with the same gentle patience she had always carried, speaking softly until fear gave way to trust. The caretakers watched with quiet amazement, as even the most nervous creatures gradually relaxed beneath her calm presence. Near sunset, the oldest caretaker approached Lucian with eyes shining warmly. "Your Majesty," the elderly woman said, "I have worked here for 40 years, and I have rarely seen the sanctuary grow this peaceful in a single afternoon." Lucian glanced toward Clara, who was laughing quietly as a young wolf pup clumsily followed her across the grass. "Neither have I," he answered. As evening settled over the sanctuary, Clara prepared to return home. Before she stepped into the waiting carriage, Lucian walked beside her through the blooming lavender garden that surrounded the entrance. For a moment they simply admired the fading sunlight painting the fields with shades of gold and silver. Finally Lucian smiled. "May I ask you one last question?" Clara looked at him with gentle curiosity. "Of course." His silver eyes reflected the first light of the rising moon as he asked, "If you found that stubborn wolf alone in the forest again, knowing everything you know now, would you still stop to help him?" Clara smiled without needing even a moment to think. "Every single time." Lucian laughed softly, the quiet sound carrying a warmth few people in the kingdom had ever witnessed. "Then I hope he never forgets how fortunate he was." Clara stepped into the carriage as the horses began the peaceful journey back toward Black Hollow Forest, unaware that stories of the compassionate Omega healer had already begun spreading across the kingdom, inspiring hope in places where fear had once spoken the loudest. Long after the carriage disappeared beyond the hills, Lucian remained standing beneath the evening sky, watching the distant road with quiet gratitude. He had entered the forest searching for answers about a wounded wolf, yet he had found something far greater. He had found proof that true strength was never measured by power, titles, or the crown resting upon a king's head. It was measured by the courage to show kindness when no reward was expected, to see dignity where others saw weakness, and to choose compassion before judgment. And somewhere beneath the same moon that had first brought their paths together, destiny continued weaving a future neither of them had ever dared imagine, reminding the kingdom that the gentlest hearts often carried the greatest power of all.